This story will shatter all the usual stereotypes about knightly tournaments and noble duels. In the fall of 1415, two completely different military systems clashed on a narrow field in France. The English king led his weary men to a place from which there seemed to be no escape. The French nobility was absolutely confident of a quick and easy victory over their outnumbered enemy. Watch the video to the end to find out how ordinary spring mud and pieces of wood changed the rules of warfare forever. Preparations for the campaign of 1415 began long before the ship set sail. The English command built an unprecedented logistical network across the entire island. Hundreds of craftsmen worked around the clock to produce arrows, tying them into huge sheaves for transport. Blacksmiths forged arrowheads, and carpenters prepared long U-blanks for bows. Every detail of this huge supply machine was under the strict control of royal officials. Gathering provisions was a complex mathematical task for the quartermasters of the time. Thousands of barrels of salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables were brought to the warehouses. Transporting all this property required a colossal merchant fleet assembled from ports across the country. Ships were converted to accommodate large numbers of people and military cargo. The English created a veritable floating base capable of supporting the army in enemy territory for a long time. The system of recruiting archers also differed from the classic feudal militia of previous centuries. The king signed contracts with captains who undertook to bring a certain number of trained archers. These men received regular salaries and viewed war as a professional job. They trained from an early age, developing incredible physical strength to draw powerful bows. This approach ensured high discipline and standardization of weapons in the English army. Particular attention was paid to the manufacture of bowstrings from hemp and silk. Archers always carried a spare bowstring under their headgear to protect it from moisture. A wet bowstring lost its elasticity, rendering the bow completely useless. Therefore, keeping weapons dry became the main concern of every warrior. This inconspicuous fact would play a decisive role in the future events of the French campaign. The English fleet crossed the strait and dropped anchor at the mouth of the Seine. The landing of troops was organized according to a pre-approved strategic plan. Engineers immediately began erecting temporary fortifications to protect the camp. The troops were deployed in strict order, ready for a long siege. The logistical machine began its work on the continent, distributing supplies among the units. The informational preparation for the campaign also deserves detailed consideration. The king sent out manifestos justifying his claims to the French throne. He sought to present himself as the legitimate ruler, reclaiming his ancestral territories. This diplomatic maneuver was necessary to prevent interference from other European states. Lawyers and scribes worked alongside the military, laying the paperwork foundation for the invasion. Military engineers brought with them dismantled siege engines and artillery pieces. These mechanisms required special conditions for transportation and assembly on site. Craftsmen numbered the parts in advance to speed up the installation process under the city walls. Gunpowder was transported in special barrels, carefully protecting it from the slightest spark. The English army represented the cutting edge of technology of its era. Reconnaissance played a key role in ensuring the safety of marching columns. Small detachments constantly scanned the terrain in search of fodder and convenient roads. They compiled detailed descriptions of fords, bridges, and possible locations for ambushes. This information flowed to headquarters, where further maneuvers of the entire army were planned. The command tried to minimize surprises in unfamiliar hostile territory. Financing the campaign required a tremendous strain on the economy of the entire kingdom. The king pawned his jewels and levied special taxes on the clergy and cities. Every shilling spent was carefully recorded in special debt books. Soldiers had to be sure that their pay would be paid on time. Stable financing prevented desertion and maintained high morale among the ranks of the archers. This whole complex preparation mechanism was aimed at achieving one global goal. The army had to quickly capture key ports and secure the coast. However, the reality of medieval warfare quickly made adjustments to the command's ideal plans. English troops surrounded the port city of Harfleur, expecting the defenders to surrender quickly. However, the walls proved too strong, and the garrison demonstrated incredible resilience and determination. Instead of a swift assault, an exhausting positional battle began, wearing down both sides. Engineers began digging long trenches and erecting shelters for artillery. Siege guns fired continuously at the city's fortifications day and night. Huge stone cannonballs destroyed the towers, but the inhabitants managed to repair the breaches before dawn. This artillery duel required enormous amounts of gunpowder and physical effort on the part of the artillerymen. The besiegers' camp turned into a noisy, open-air production workshop. Carpenters constantly repaired damaged mechanisms, keeping the pace of bombardment at a high level. The main problem for the British was not the enemy's defenses, but the natural conditions around the city. The marshy terrain and heavy rains turned the camp into a sea of mud. Violations of sanitary standards led to the rapid spread of severe intestinal disorders among the soldiers. People lost strength faster than if they had been fighting daily battles. The command was powerless in the face of this invisible but extremely destructive threat. Fresh food supplies began to dwindle rapidly, forcing quartermasters to cut rations. Soldiers ate spoiled food, which only exacerbated their physical exhaustion. There was not a single intact field left around the camp that could provide fodder for the troops. The fleet was unable to deliver new supplies in a timely manner due to autumn storms in the strait. The army found itself in a kind of isolation, chained to the walls of the impregnable city. The defenders of Harfleur regularly made daring sorties, destroying English siege structures. They set fire to wooden shelters and quickly retreated behind reliable stone walls. These actions kept the English in constant tension, depriving them of peaceful sleep. The king had to allocate more and more people to guard the engineering communications. The siege dragged on, disrupting the initial strategic schedule of the entire French campaign. After a month and a half, the defenders of the city finally agreed to an honorable surrender. The English gained control of an important port, but the price was too high. The army lost almost a third of its original strength due to disease and exhaustion. Thousands of soldiers who were unable to continue the campaign were sent back to England by ship. The remaining troops needed rest, but there was no time left for recovery. The king faced an extremely difficult strategic choice with winter approaching. Returning home meant admitting defeat and losing authority among the nobility. Continuing a large-scale invasion deep into France was impossible due to a lack of manpower. The decision was made to make a symbolic march to the English fortress of Calais. This maneuver was intended to demonstrate to the French crown the determination and strength of English arms. Preparing for the march required getting rid of all unnecessary and heavy equipment. Artillery and heavy siege engines were left in the captured city under the protection of the garrison. The soldiers took with them only weapons and a minimal supply of provisions for several days. The column had to move lightly in order to outpace the gathering French forces. Speed became the main condition for survival for the diminished English army. The French command closely monitored the actions of their weakened enemy. They began to assemble a huge army to cut off the English route to the safety of Calais. Bridges across major rivers were destroyed, and crossings were reinforced with armed detachments. The local population was ordered to destroy any supplies in the path of the English columns. The trap was slowly closing, leaving no room for tactical maneuvers. The English soldiers entered hostile territory, cut off from their supply bases. Ahead of them lay hundreds of kilometers of exhausting travel under constant threat of attack. Each new day brought only worsening weather and increasing fatigue among the ranks of the riflemen. Advancing through enemy territory became a real test of human endurance. British intelligence introduced a unique system of mapping the terrain on the go. Experienced trackers moved far ahead of the column, sketching safe routes with charcoal on pieces of parchment. These improvised maps were immediately passed on to the commanders to adjust the direction of the entire army. The English employed a tactic of strict silence during night marches. The huge mass of people moved in absolute silence, wrapping metal parts of their equipment in cloth. Commands were passed along the chain with light touches or conventional hand gestures. This allowed them to secretly bypass large French garrisons without attracting unnecessary attention from patrols. Such secrecy was atypical for large armies of that time and required the highest level of coordination. Movement was complicated by the need to constantly cross small water obstacles. Engineers developed a method for quickly creating pontoons from bundles of dry reeds and lightboards. These structures could support the weight of a fully equipped soldier and were easily carried by hand. After crossing the river, the rafts were immediately destroyed so that pursuers would not have any ready means of transporting their forces. This forced French troops to waste precious time searching for deep fords. Deep fords across the Somme River, carefully guarded by the enemy, posed a particular danger. The British had to make a sharp detour deep into the continent, moving away from their final goal. They moved along the riverbed, looking for unguarded shoals away from large settlements. Soldiers crossed the icy water, holding their valuable weapons high above their heads. Any loss of balance in the turbulent stream threatened the loss of precious arrows or bows. Feeding on the march became a real science of survival in the wild. The local fields were empty, so the soldiers gathered edible roots and forest nuts. Special foraging detachments searched for abandoned stashes of local peasants in the dense forests. People learned to grind dry grains between stones, creating a kind of nutritious flour. From this flour, during short stops, they baked hard, unleavened cakes to sustain the strength of the fighters. The soldiers' shoes became completely unusable from constant movement over sharp stones and slush. The archers wrapped their feet with pieces of thick fabric and secured them with strong ropes. This improvised protection allowed them to continue moving despite their sore feet. In the evenings, the soldiers dried these bandages over small hidden fires lit in deep pits. Maintaining mobility was the key to the survival of the entire retreating group. The French vanguard was constantly nearby, exerting intense psychological pressure. The British always set up a double ring of guards around their temporary camps. The sentries changed every hour so as not to fall asleep from extreme fatigue while on duty. No one took off their armor or let go of their weapons, even during a short sleep. The constant expectation of an attack exhausted the soldiers' nervous systems more than physical labor. Discipline was maintained by the most severe measures on the part of the military command. Any looting of churches or unauthorized absence from duty was punished immediately. The king personally ensured that order was maintained, understanding that chaos would destroy the army faster than the French. Unity and obedience to orders became the only shield against the vastly superior forces of the enemy. The soldiers trusted their leader, who shared with them all the hardships of this endless march. By the end of October, the army finally found an unguarded ford and crossed the Somme. It was a moment of incredible relief, but the joy proved premature. The French army, moving parallel along good roads, managed to overtake the English. A huge mass of armored soldiers blocked the way to the safe haven of Calais. A clash between two irreconcilable enemies became absolutely inevitable. Tired, hungry, and wet, the English archers found themselves face to face with a fresh army. There was no choice but to prepare for a decisive confrontation on foreign soil. The English commander understood perfectly well that open combat on a wide plain would end in disaster. The French cavalry would simply trample the thin lines of exhausted archers with flanking attacks. Therefore, choosing the ideal place for defense became a task of paramount importance. Scouts found a narrow, plowed field sandwiched between two dense forests. This field was located near the small French settlement of Agincourt. The forests at the edges created a natural funnel that narrowed toward the English positions. This configuration of the terrain completely ruled out the possibility of a wide flanking maneuver by the enemy. The French were forced to advance in a single dense front, directly at the English infantry lines. Nature itself had built impenetrable walls to protect the vulnerable English flanks. The field was freshly plowed, recently worked by local peasants. Heavy autumn rains had turned the loosened soil into deep, sticky clay slurry. Moving across such a surface without heavy equipment already required enormous physical effort. For warriors clad in steel, this field was bound to be a real trap. The English command relied precisely on this sticky, movement-absorbing mud. The British position was on a small hill, which gave them an additional tactical advantage. The riflemen had an excellent view of the entire field, allowing them to control the advance of enemy columns. The advancing French had to move slightly uphill, overcoming the resistance of the slippery ground. Every 100 meters of such an advance took a tremendous amount of energy from the heavily armed fighters. The terrain worked as an invisible ally of the English crown. The width of the field at its narrowest point was only about 800 meters. This space was ideal for creating a dense curtain of fire from longbows. No section of the advancing front remained out of reach of the deadly arrows. The French army was physically unable to deploy all its enormous forces on such a narrow strip of land. The enemy's numerical superiority was offset by the cleverly chosen topography of the terrain. The dense trees at the edges of the field were intertwined with thick, thorny undergrowth. Any attempt to break through these thickets would have destroyed the formation of the advancing troops. Inside the forest, it was impossible to organize the coordinated movement of large masses of people in armor. The English deliberately positioned part of their forces among the outer trees for flanking fire. The forest became a reliable edge of the anvil on which it was planned to crush the pride of France. The English commanders personally inspected every meter of their future defensive line. They ordered the small mounds to be leveled and the pits that interfered with dense formation to be filled in. The entire army lined up in a single line, without setting aside reserves in the deep rear. The men stood shoulder to shoulder, feeling the support of their comrades at this critical moment. The choice of position dictated precisely this, the most concentrated option for the deployment of forces. The uniqueness of this situation lay in the perfect coincidence of many natural factors. The narrow space, dense forests, sticky clay, and slight elevation all came together. Without even one of these elements, the British tactical plan could have easily collapsed. The commander was able to read the terrain better than his overconfident opponents. The field at Agincourt was ready to enter the world history of military art. The deployment of forces on this ideal defensive field required a special approach to each soldier. It was necessary to create an impenetrable wall of flesh and wood against the advancing steel avalanche. The English army consisted mainly of foot archers armed with their famous longbows. These men did not wear heavy metal armor, limiting themselves to thick leather jackets or quilted gambesons. The lack of heavy armor gave them incredible freedom of movement on the battlefield. Their main advantage was their phenomenal rate of fire and coordinated actions as part of large units. The archers' weapons required many years of continuous training to be used effectively in battle. In front of their positions, each archer drove a long wooden stake into the soft ground. These stakes were sharpened on both sides and tilted toward the enemy at an acute angle. They formed a solid, bristly wall designed to stop any rapid breakthrough. The stakes were driven in so tightly that a large man in armor could not squeeze between them. This simple engineering barrier became the basis for the survival of the lightly armed English infantry. The archers formed wedges protruding forward at the edges of the main battle formations. This formation allowed them to fire crossfire at the advancing enemy columns. The arrowheads pierced vulnerable spots in the armor on the flanks, where the protection was less robust. The archers did not act individually, but released arrows in huge clouds on the command of their officers. The sky literally darkened from thousands of wooden shafts flying along a high ballistic trajectory. Each archer carried 2 large bundles of arrows stuck directly into the ground at their feet. This arrangement of ammunition allowed for maximum weapon reloading speed. A person did not need to reach for a quiver. It was enough to simply lower their hand. The dirt on the arrowhead served as an additional deadly factor when hitting an open wound. The entire shooting process was brought to absolute automatism through many hours of daily practice. Between the groups of archers were small detachments of heavy infantry with halberds and swords. Their task was to hold back any enemies who managed to break through the line of stakes. These fighters formed a strong center around which the entire active defense system was built. Unlike the archers, they wore full-plate armor and closed helmets with visors. The interaction between light and heavy infantry was the key to the stability of the entire English formation. The commanders were in the front ranks with their subordinates, sharing the common danger. This raised the morale of the weary soldiers to incredible heights in the face of a vastly superior enemy. The king himself dismounted and stood in the center of the formation, showing that no one was going to retreat. The lack of a way to retreat turned the exhausted men into a monolithic and desperate force. The soldiers understood that their lives depended solely on the speed and accuracy of their own shots. The archers' weapons were simple yew-sticks, but they concealed enormous power. The tension of such a bow was equivalent to lifting a load weighing more than 40 kilograms with one hand. An arrow fired from close range could easily pierce thin steel and oak shields. The effective range exceeded 200 meters, which allowed them to start firing long before closing in. It was the most advanced long-range weapon of mass destruction in medieval Europe. The silence in the English ranks before the battle contrasted with the noise in the French camp. The commanders strictly forbade any conversation, demanding complete concentration on the task at hand. People prayed silently, checked the tension of their bowstrings, and adjusted their stakes stuck in the mud. Each soldier knew exactly where to shoot and just waited for the commander to give the go-ahead. Discipline transformed a crowd of exhausted peasants and artisans into a perfect military machine. The organization of the English defense was flawless from the point of view of military science at that time. They used all the resources available to them to maximize the strength of their narrow positions. But even this ideal line of defense seemed objectively very fragile in the face of the colossal French armada. The enemy's huge army was preparing to unleash all its overwhelming power on the small ranks of archers. Two completely different military doctrines froze in anticipation of an inevitable head-on collision on the plowed field. The French army was the most brilliant and expensive gathering of nobility in European history. Thousands of aristocrats in shining armor flocked from all over the country for easy glory. They were accompanied by personal detachments of armed servants, crossbowmen, and spearmen in rich clothing. Visually, this army resembled a huge, colorful parade rather than a cohesive fighting unit. The main problem with this colossal army was the complete lack of a unified command center. Each noble lord considered himself an independent commander and did not want to obey the orders of other commanders. The upper aristocracy constantly argued over the right to stand in the prestigious front row of the attacking column. No one wanted to give up their place, considering it a terrible insult to their family honor. Personal ambitions and vanity completely paralyzed any attempts to create a competent tactical plan. French commanders treated their own long-range combat units with contempt. Experienced mercenary crossbowmen were pushed to the back rows, where they were of no use. The nobility considered long-range shooting to be the lot of commoners, unworthy of true, noble warriors. They sincerely believed that the outcome of any battle should be decided only in direct close combat. This arrogance deprived the French army of the most important element of fire support before the attack. The knight's armor was perfected for protection, but it weighed an incredible amount. Full plate armor provided reliable protection against slashing blows from swords and light projectiles. However, it was extremely difficult to move around on foot, especially on uneven and slippery surfaces. The visors of the helmets severely limited visibility, turning the surrounding world into a narrow slit. In cramped conditions, such armor turned from protection into an immovable steel prison. The plan of attack was primitive and boiled down to a massive frontal assault with the full force of the armored infantry. The nobility dismounted, leaving their vehicles behind in order to attack in a dense, unified formation. They planned to simply overwhelm the small number of Englishmen with the mass and quality of their heavy weaponry. No one took into account the narrowing of the field and the quality of the soggy clay soil underfoot. Confidence in their own invulnerability overshadowed all the basic principles of tactical analysis. Controlling such a disorganized mass in the heat of battle was an absolutely impossible task. There was no system for transmitting orders from the center to the flanks or to the rear ranks. As soon as the front line began to move, the rear ranks automatically rushed to follow, creating a terrible crush. The banners of noble families mingled into a single forest of fabric and wood, disorienting the ordinary soldiers. The army turned into an uncontrollable steel wave, driven only by the thirst for glory. On the eve of the battle, the French camp resembled a noisy festival rather than a military gathering. Knights drank wine, played dice, and divided the ransoms for prisoners who had not yet been captured. They were so confident of success that they did not even post proper guard duty. Loud shouts and laughter could be heard from the English positions throughout the cold autumn night. This self-confidence contrasted sharply with the grim concentration of their hungry opponents. The power of French weapons was undeniable on solid ground in the conditions of a nightly tournament. However, the reality of the field at Agincourt dictated completely different, much harsher rules. Heavy armor, crowding, and lack of discipline proved fatal for the flower of the French nation. A huge mechanism had been set in motion, and none of the lords present could stop it. The army prepared to take its fateful step into the sticky clay abyss. All night before the decisive clash, it rained continuously over the field of Agincourt. The cold autumn water soaked the clothes of the English archers, who had nowhere to shelter from the weather. The men sat directly on the wet ground, clutching their precious weapons and spare bowstrings. They remained absolutely silent, obeying the strict orders of their commanders not to attract the attention of the enemy. The silence was broken only by the sound of the downpour and the noises of noisy celebrations from the French camp. Heavy rainfall had completely destroyed the soil structure of the recently plowed field. The ground had turned into a thick mush capable of sucking a person's leg up to the knee. The clay became slippery and sticky, making every step taken on it much heavier. Nature had prepared the perfect trap for people encased in dozens of kilograms of steel armor. Water filled all the unevenness of the terrain, creating hidden puddles several dozen centimeters deep. The French knights spent the night under awnings and in large, comfortable tents. However, even they suffered from the dampness that penetrated the thick fabric of the tents. Many aristocrats stayed awake, discussing plans for the next day and arguing about their places in the ranks. Their armor lay nearby, carefully polished by their squires before the impending triumph. No one paid attention to what was happening on the battlefield just outside the walls of their shelters. At dawn, the rain stopped, but the sky remained covered with heavy gray clouds. The morning fog lay like a thick blanket over the soggy fields, hiding the army's positions from each other. The air was saturated with dampness and the smell of wet earth, foreshadowing a heavy and gloomy day. The English soldiers began to rise slowly, stretching their muscles stiff from the cold. They inspected their weapons, carefully pulling the dry strings on their elastic yew-bows. The English received a meager breakfast consisting of leftover dry cakes and water. Many soldiers said their last prayers, and priests walked among the ranks, blessing the men for battle. The king rode along the ranks on a small horse, offering words of encouragement to his loyal subjects. He reminded them of honor, home, and that there was nowhere to retreat. The soldiers' faces showed extreme fatigue, but their eyes revealed cold determination. The French camp awoke noisily, with the loud sounds of trumpets and the shouts of commanders. The long and complicated process of dressing thousands of knights in their heavy battle armor began. The squires tightened the straps, fastened the plate shields, and handed their lords heavy swords. The army slowly formed into battle order, creating incredible confusion and jostling in its ranks. Due to a lack of coordination, the process of forming the attacking columns took several long hours. When the fog began to lift, the armies could finally see each other in the morning light. The difference in the size and appearance of the troops became obvious to every soldier on the field. The thin, gray-brown line of the English seemed insignificant against the backdrop of the gleaming French sea of steel. French banners flew proudly in the wind, displaying the coats of arms of the most powerful families on the continent. The space between them was a flat strip of sticky, treacherous brown mud. The English commander realized that the long wait was working against his exhausted forces. His men needed to act quickly, while adrenaline kept fatigue and cold at bay. Waiting deprived the archers of the initiative and allowed the enemy to gather even more troops. The situation required an immediate and radical solution that would provoke the enemy into a premature attack. The king made a bold tactical decision that changed the entire course of the coming battle. He ordered his troops to pull out their defensive stakes and begin a slow advance. It was a huge risk, as the light infantry remained defenseless during this maneuver. The disciplined Englishmen carried out the order precisely, closing the distance to the enemy positions. They moved in unison, ready at any moment to stop and unleash the first deadly cloud. The battle began, not with a furious charge of armor, but with the measured steps of weary English archers. The English formation slowly advanced across the soggy field, maintaining perfect alignment. The men struggled to pull their feet out of the sticky clay, trying not to lose their shoes. As soon as they reached effective firing range, a sharp command to halt was given. The archers immediately drove their protective pointed stakes back into the soft autumn ground. The barrier was restored in a matter of minutes, and the archers prepared for their first mass volley. The commanders waved their batons, and thousands of bowstrings simultaneously emitted a low, humming sound. A huge black cloud of arrows soared into the gray sky, blocking out the daylight. This mass of wood and steel rained down on the dense ranks of the French vanguard. The first volley did not inflict fatal damage on the knights clad in armor, but it caused terrible confusion. The sound of thousands of arrowheads striking steel armor resembled a deafening drumbeat. The French aristocrats were enraged by such audacity on the part of commoners with bows. The hail of arrows provoked them, wounding their pride and forcing them to instinctively cover themselves with shields. The barrage did not stop for a second, with the English firing up to 10 arrows per minute. The air was filled with the whistling of flying projectiles, which fell at an incredibly steep angle. This continuous barrage was the perfect catalyst for a premature, disorganized French attack. Without waiting for a general order, the French heavy cavalry rushed into a disorganized frontal attack. The armored horsemen tried to quickly cover the distance separating the two armies. However, the sticky clay instantly extinguished the speed of their rapid dash along the narrow flank. Their movement got bogged down in deep mud, breaking the battle formations of the advancing elite troops. Instead of a crushing ram attack, the result was a slow, clumsy, and completely useless maneuver. Meanwhile, a huge mass of dismounted French knights began their difficult advance. Thousands of heavily armored warriors marched through the mud, visors down and lances raised. Due to the narrow field, they instinctively huddled together, seeking shelter from the English flanking fire. The formation became denser with every meter, turning into an uncontrollable monolithic crowd. The men were suffocating in their closed helmets due to the enormous physical effort required to move across the soggy field. English arrows continued to fall on this dense mass, exhausting the strength of the advancing aristocrats. Due to extreme exhaustion, the fallen warriors became an insurmountable obstacle for those following behind. The rear ranks continued to push forward, preventing the fallen from rising from the deep mud. An incredible crush ensued, in which people lost consciousness from lack of air and confinement. The French army deprived itself of maneuverability, turning into a rigid steel mass. When the French vanguard finally reached the line of stakes, it was completely exhausted. They were met by rested English halberdiers and swordsmen, delivering precise and deadly blows. The sharpened stakes prevented the knights from using their body weight to break through the formation. They found themselves trapped between the palisade in front and the pressing crowd of their own comrades behind. The battle turned into a brutal, close-quarters melee at point-blank range. The lightly armed English archers put down their bows and engaged in close combat. Armed with light axes and clubs, they quickly surrounded the knights who had lost their maneuverability. The lack of heavy equipment allowed the English to move easily through the mud, avoiding the enemy's slow strikes. They knocked the heavy warriors off their feet, forcing the French nobility to surrender en masse. The speed and agility of the simple archers completely surpassed the static defense of the European aristocracy. The battlefield turned into a buzzing mass of people fighting in a deep mess. The French elite found themselves trapped by their own numbers, armor, and self-confidence. Their magnificent weapons were completely useless in this incredible crowding. The English methodically captured the paralyzed vanguard of the enemy, dictating their terms. What was supposed to be a triumph for chivalry turned into its greatest historical defeat. The second line of the French army watched in horror as disaster befell their vanguard. Despite the obvious failure of the first attack, they didn't stop their heavy advance. A huge mass of fresh troops stepped onto the already plowed and crowded field. The mud became even deeper, turning into an absolutely impassable quagmire for heavy armor. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that they had to step over their retreating comrades. The crowding reached such proportions that the French soldiers could not raise their weapons to strike. Trapped on all sides by their own comrades, they stood completely helpless. The English heavy infantry acted in unison, methodically pushing back the enemy and destroying their formation. The discipline of the English formation remained unshakable, despite hours of physical exertion. The small army held its positions, repelling the onslaught of an endless human wave. The French commanders, who were in the rear ranks, did not see the real picture of what was happening in front. They continued to give orders to attack, pushing their troops into the bottleneck that had formed. The pressure from behind deprived the frontline units of any opportunity to retreat in an organized manner for regrouping. The army turned into a machine that methodically ground down its own resources. The battlefield became a symbol of the complete tactical failure of the French high command. The English actively took noble French lords prisoner, counting on huge ransoms. The prisoners were taken to the rear, where a huge crowd of disarmed aristocrats had gathered. The number of captured knights soon exceeded the size of the English army itself. This created an unforeseen threat to the English king's weary troops amid the ongoing battle. A huge mass of armed men still remained on the field, posing a serious danger. The third line of French troops, consisting mainly of militiamen, froze in indecision. Seeing the defeat of the elite units, they lost all desire to continue this senseless attack. Some units began to turn around and silently leave the battlefield, fleeing from certain defeat. The lack of unified command led to a spontaneous retreat of a large part of the reserves. The morale of the French army was finally broken by the sight of this grand catastrophe. At that moment, the English camp in the rear was suddenly attacked by a small French detachment. The attackers looted the royal tents and stole some of the valuable property and crown jewels. This event caused serious concern for the English king in the midst of battle. He feared that the captured knights in the rear might revolt, arming themselves with abandoned weapons. A critical situation arose, requiring the most severe and uncompromising solution. The English monarch gave a harsh order that went down in the history of this campaign. He ordered the immediate neutralization of most of the captured French soldiers. This step was dictated solely by military necessity and the army's instinct for self-preservation. Guarding prisoners took too much energy, which was needed to repel a possible new attack. The harsh logic of war prevailed over the traditional rules of chivalry. The French reserves, remaining on the edges of the field, finally refused to continue the battle. They saw their best warriors suffer a crushing defeat at the hands of the despised archers. The aristocrats silently left the battlefield, leading their surviving troops away along the muddy roads. The great army, assembled from all over France, was disintegrating before their eyes, turning into disorganized groups of fugitives. The field was left to the exhausted but victorious English troops. The battle ended, leaving behind a completely new political reality in Europe. The English infantry proved its absolute superiority over the slow-moving heavy cavalry. Mud, stakes, and long yew bows forever changed the concept of military tactics. The pride of the French crown was trampled in the deep autumn clay. The grueling campaign, which lasted many months, ended in a grand triumph for iron English discipline. The Battle of Agincourt was a turning point in the entire 100 Years' War between the two countries. On that day, the French crown lost almost all of its senior military command. The most noble lords, dukes, and influential counts were taken prisoner or left on the battlefield. The loss of so many aristocrats provoked a deep political crisis within France itself. The country was left defenseless against further large-scale English invasions of its territory. The English king did not just win a military victory, he proved the legitimacy of his claims. This incredible success was perceived by contemporaries as a clear manifestation of divine will and support. The monarch's authority soared to the heavens, securing him the absolute support of Parliament and the people. Despite their enormous fatigue, the army celebrated their incredible triumph right on the battlefield. This success allowed England to dictate its terms in negotiations for decades to come. The battle finally cemented the dominance of infantry with ranged weapons over heavy cavalry. The longbow proved its phenomenal effectiveness against all types of steel armor. Military theorists across Europe began urgently revising their classic defensive strategies. The construction of armies began to gradually shift towards the mobility and firepower of infantrymen. The era of invincible knightly wedges was rapidly and irrevocably becoming a thing of the past. The remnants of the English army continued their interrupted march to the safe haven of Calais. This time, no one pursued them. The French forces were completely demoralized. The soldiers returned home, not just as survivors of a difficult campaign, but as national heroes. They brought with them rich trophies and noble prisoners, guaranteeing huge ransoms. The campaign, which had been on the verge of complete collapse, ended in a great historical success. The English command drew important conclusions from the mistakes and difficulties of this campaign. They improved their logistics system, paying even more attention to the military supply of troops. The experience of the Siege of Harfleur demonstrated the need to develop more mobile and powerful artillery. Archery training became even more intensive and widespread throughout England. The state focused on professionalizing the army and enforcing strict military discipline. The history of this battle has been overgrown with many legends and myths in the following centuries. Writers and poets sang the praises of the bravery of the English archers and the courage of their young king. Agincourt became a symbol that steadfastness and tactics are more important than numerical superiority. The study of this battle is still part of the compulsory curriculum at military academies around the world. The topography of the field and the disposition of forces are analyzed as a perfect example of positional defense. The longbow remained important in the English army for over 100 years. Only the widespread development of firearms was able to finally replace this simple weapon. However, the principles of dense barrage fire established at Agincourt remained unchanged. Artillery and muskets simply replaced wooden shafts and steel tips. The tactical foundation of the victory of 1415 outlived its creators for centuries. The mud of Agincourt swallowed not only the knights, but also the old rules of warfare. It was a clash between harsh pragmatism and outdated, inflexible aristocratic romanticism. The system based on discipline, training, and the competent use of terrain won. The survival of the army was placed above the personal glory of individual noble commanders. This concept became the basis for the creation of all modern professional armed forces. The weary archers, trampling the autumn clay, forever inscribed their names in the history books. Their incredible transition from the brink of destruction to absolute triumph is astonishing. The Battle of Agincourt remains the greatest reminder of the unpredictability of military conflicts. It proves that the outcome of historical confrontations is often decided by the most insignificant details. The English triumph became an eternal monument to soldierly fortitude and outstanding tactical calculation.